Okay, I'm very happy to welcome Raymond Blake with us this afternoon and this morning for him. Raymond is an historian. He's teaching in the University of Regina in Canada, and is an expert of Canadian history and the history of citizenship in Canada. He's very famous, and I'm very proud because Raymond is here today. Okay, and he's going to talk about the place and the marginal man, woman, rural voters, and Newfoundland attitudes towards Canada from 1867 to 1949. Okay, so this is your turn.
Well, thank you very much, Marie-Christine, and the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, well, in the meantime, while it's loading, I wanted to say that I was really impressed at the start this morning with Professor Sinardet's presentation. Brilliant. Asked us to think about marginal man, marginal woman in different ways, raised very important questions about individual or the group, questions about agency, questions about mobility, questions about success of marginal man. My paper addresses some of those issues, and the marginal man, woman, people that I wish to speak about are not really differentiated by race as we would see them, but they would certainly see themselves as differentiated by ethnicity. One of the things which is, I should say, thank you very much for inviting me to your conference. I really appreciate it. I was not familiar with Mr. Park's marginal man or woman until I got the invitation for the conference. And it's really interesting how once I started looking at Mr. Parks, how the notion that he's developed around marginal man, focusing on race and ethnic relations, has been moved and embraced by all sorts of people, as we heard this morning, dealing with social phenomena, including gender, occupation, creative activities. And what I try to do in this paper here is to move it beyond the notion of culture. And so this is my presentation. Well, thank you. And one of the things, and I guess the second slide that I have here, it really suggests that I would like to move the notion of marginal man, woman from identity, culture to notions of place. And one of the things that is very important, I think, in the work that I do is I am looking at a place that is marked particularly by poverty and isolation. And I try to show in this paper how notions of marginal man, marginal woman is influenced in many ways by more than a location on a map, because place becomes associated with identities, becomes associated with exercising power in particular instances. And what I try to show in this particular paper is that marginal man, woman becomes involved at pivotal moments, or what Parks himself calls when the routine of existing habit and the breaks of custom, that marginal man then comes to play an important role because they become self-actualizing and they make their own decisions depending on how those ideas get played out around what is beneficial to them. So in my view, the marginal man occupies a place on a larger horizon. They adopt a keen intelligence. they develop a rational viewpoint in large part because of their identity, and I would suggest in a particular place that they operate. And so place creates a special place. It's not just, as I say on this screen here, a location on a map, but it's something much greater than that. And if the next slide, please, the area that I want to, and I guess the next slide after that, and what I want to show is, I guess I'm a little behind the PowerPoint here, so if we could do one more. And what I want to look at is the role of the marginal man in two historical moments. The area that I want to talk about is Newfoundland, which is on the margins of North America. It was an area since the 15th century had been fought over by England and France. By 1713, France surrenders its claim to the territory in the Treaty of Utrecht, but it continues to maintain fishing and landing rights there until about 1904 with the Entente Cordiale in 1904. That area that you see in red, Newfoundland, was the last part of British North America to join Canada. Canada was created in 1867 as a nation. Newfoundland did not join till 80 years later, the last of the colonies to do so. And what I want to look at is the role of the marginal man in that process. If I could have the next slide, please. Quite often, when people look at voting patterns, they quite often look at a region's economic well-being. They look at issues of poverty. They look at levels of education. They look at levels of literacy. And in the case that I want to talk about here, in the two cases I want to talk about here, people, historians, commentators have said, you know, those people made the wrong choice. They made a stupid mistake. And the people who voted in those two instances of Confederation have been what I call marginal men and women, have been dismissed as dim-witted, uninformed, gullible. These were people who, because of their stupidity and ignorance, made the wrong choices in 1869 and in 1949. If we could have the next slide, please. And if you look at the reaction of historians, and I'll move through this rather quickly, the governor at the time appointed by Great Britain, he chastised the people who were living in those areas outside the provincial capital, basically hawking out a subsistence living, a little more than that, and as being ignorant, lawless, as being unfit for democratic government. And even historians have picked up on that as well. And one historian, and I have a quote here from him writing in a book about Confederation, said that the decision on whether or not this particular colony the decision on Confederation should not be left to a poverty-stricken, illiterate people. The next slide, please. And and we can skip this one and go to the next one. And if you look at the 1948 vote, you will see a very similar reaction. And here is some commentary from the moments when the vote happened in 1948, and more recently, one of the most recent books. They are really talking about how, again, that the marginal people lived in marginal communities, the marginal man and woman just did not have the capacity to understand difficult issues. And here is from the Archbishop of Newfoundland, who talks about people behaving with utter stupidity. And another book by Greg Malone that you can see here talks about where people were so gullible, they did not know what was happening to them. And the next slide, please. And what I try to argue in the paper in some detail is that democracy is a competitive process. Political leaders create narratives. Narratives are constructed from ideas, from ideological concerns. They are based on truths and sometimes on misinformation. But it is a part of an attempt to persuade individuals to accept one narrative or the other. Voters weigh those narratives. How those narratives meet their hopes, fears, anxieties, aspirations those are the decisions that then decide a political outcome. So democracy is competitive. It's about narratives. It's about decision making. It's about who can persuade. And I want to turn now very quickly to those two episodes. So if we could have the next slide, that in the Confederation Debates of 1869, there were two groups. They were known as the Confederates and originally the anti-Confederates. So there are two groups. This is a single issue election. And those two particular groups and the individuals I have here, Ambrose, Frederick Carter, are in favor of Confederation. Charles Fox Bennett, a merchant, was opposed to Confederation. Next slide, please. And the Confederation narrative of 1869 was based on 3 or 4 points. One, union was the best option for Newfoundland going forward because it would mean more investment in the colony's resources. It would mean an end to the island's isolation because there would be transportation links to the larger unit in Canada. There would be an attempt to sort of bring in a new level of discourse around politics because the community would be much larger. And there was a notion that Newfoundland could join Canada and maintain its distinctiveness, because one of the things that the new nation privileged was the notions of diversity. The elites were in favor of union. The British government was in favor of union, and they expected the marginal man and woman who normally voted in elections basically following the lead of the elites. And the elites expected exactly the same thing here. The next slide, please. However, in this particular debate, the anti-Confederate narrative talked about, I guess, what we could call some of the concerns of a liberal state. The powers of the state were too large. The powers of the state would impose on the outlying communities, the marginal communities, two of the most onerous aspects of citizenship: taxation, that with Confederation, the narrative went, that taxation would increase on everything, and equally important, and this had a real resonance with the marginal men in particular, and that is military service. One of the reasons for Confederation in 1867 was to defend against the Americans. The Americans are coming out of the Civil War. There's a great fear in Canada that the Americans are going to annex Canada, something that they had tried a number of times since the 1770s. And Charles Fox Bennett said, you know very well about impressment. During the Napoleonic Wars, people, British ships went around Newfoundland impressing fishermen into the Royal Navy. And so Charles Fox Bennett played on those fears as well. Newfoundland had become a sort of semi-independent colony responsible for its own internal affairs. And Charles Fox Bennett played on this notion of nationalism and patriotism. It is our island. It's ours. Why are we going to surrender this to a distant, faraway, intrusive government in Ottawa, which is somewhere most people could not sort of fathom what it was. And at the same time, there were large numbers of Irish in Newfoundland, many of them, of course, coming from recently from Ireland. And they were reminded that this is another British Union. The Union of Newfoundland and Canada is just like the Union of Ireland and Great Britain, and you know how that worked out for you. So the next slide, please. And this is the pivotal part of my paper. Do voting matter to citizens? The marginal man and woman, does the election matter? And I answer a resounding yes. And if I could have the next slide, there are a couple of things which are generally important to remember here. Political campaigns were very important moments in the life of those isolated marginal communities. People participated. People participated in those events because not that they were concerned, I don't think, about the general welfare of the nation, but they were certainly concerned about their own individual circumstances. They attended those political rallies and meetings in tremendously large numbers. They voted in large numbers. There was a performance around elections. There was also violence around elections. And so elections become a moment when the marginal man, only men could vote at this time in Newfoundland. And around this particular time, there was a real sense that voting was an act of citizenship. It was an act of engagement with the state. And in the campaigns from about 1832, when I look at some of the earlier stuff through to the 19th and 20th century, that people came to vote in record numbers, even though the polling station would have been as sometimes 15, 20 kilometers away. But people would make their way there generally in small boats so that they could vote. And voting was extremely important because it gave them a voice. Sometimes, as I say on this screen, a gentle murmur, at other times, a very loud roar. And if I could have the next slide, please. And in this particular election, it was a single issue. Do you wish to join Canada? Nearly 80% of the people who were eligible to vote voted. And overwhelmingly, they said they voted and they said no. They said they did not want the option that was presented by the elites. So they voted against the elites in this particular election. If I could have the next slide, please. Much happens in Newfoundland between 1869 and the late 1940s. And I don't have time to go into all of it here, but I'll just make one point. That is, in the 1860s, there was a real concern about political citizenship. How we protect our own state, how we vote in that state. By the 1940s, there's a new dynamism. There's a new force at work for the marginal man and woman. By this time, women can vote. And there's a shift in what citizenship actually means. Citizenship is no longer about politics and about voting. It's about what the state can do for individuals, not only in moments of dire distress, but in the moments of the normal course of life. And I have here on this screen political propaganda or political posters from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand, and from Great Britain. And they're all from the early 1940s. And they all show that there is the emergence of a new social order. And T.H. Marshall calls this social citizenship. And what it means is that as a citizen of the state, you don't just have voting rights, but you have a right to a decent standard of living. You have the right to decent level of services. You have the expectation that the state is going to provide, we call this in Canada in social security, social welfare. That becomes a pivotal issue for the marginal man and woman in the 1940s. If I could have the next slide, please. Newfoundland encountered tremendous difficulty during the Great Depression, and it surrendered responsible government and became essentially a crown colony ruled by Great Britain. At the end of the war, the British government decided that it would have a national convention where citizens would elect 46 members to represent them and to decide upon their constitutional future. In this national convention, two narratives get played out. One of them is about constitution, about we deserve the right to govern our own nation. We want responsible government in Newfoundland. The other narrative that gets played out is led by J.R. Smallwood, who in the convention says, this isn't about constitution. This isn't about whether or not we have responsible government. This is about whatever form of constitution we do have coming out of the post-war period. And in this national convention is played out, it's about how are we going to be able to provide a decent life for the men and women who are living in this country, particularly those who are living without proper services, without access to schools and hospitals, people who are living a subsistence life. It is about what kind of life we're going to create for them once this national convention makes a recommendation. There's a national referendum to vote on the various choices. That is what is important to the marginal man. That is what is important to the nation. The next slide, please. And you can see some of these notions being played out here. And these are again, two individuals who represent the different narratives. One, Lester Burry, says people expect their governments to provide them with some social services and some well-being. It's a modern state that we want. Whereas the other narrative that says it's about independence of Newfoundland, their notion was social welfare programs are corrupt. They make people, it's a very conservative, very right-wing approach. And if I could have the next slide, please. And we get two groups, the Responsible Government League, which is really a conservative movement. And you can see there in that slide, don't sell your country. It's about the independence of this small island, the independence of that nation. We can take care of ourselves. We do not need anyone to take care of us. If I could have the next slide, please. The other narrative is the state can provide and must provide for the well-being of citizens. The Confederate Association appealed to the common man, to the toiling masses. And in letters and in advertisements, they talked about where the state had to provide a decent standard of living in the normal course of life. If I could have the next slide, please. The Confederate Association appealed to people, and this is an image here. In fact, this is the town that I grew up in. Isolated, accessible only by water, dependent on the fishery, very little in the way of social services. And the Confederates attacked the elites for keeping the marginal man and woman in servitude, being exploited. And these are the individuals that really needed the support of the state to live a decent life, to move out of their poverty, to have a decent education for their children, to have hospitals, to have social services, which the state did not provide. If I could have the next slide, please. It's pivotal, I think, in this particular campaign, the role of women. Women could not vote in 1869. They could not vote in Newfoundland until 1925. And in those narratives that are created, the Confederate side appealed to women, mothers. They were seen as the ones who would be concerned and most accepting of the welfare state. And one of those events that would happen in the campaigns during the referendums was the leader of the Confederates would bring children up on stage during a speech. And he would say to them, as I say here in too many words perhaps for a PowerPoint, that John or Susan, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And he would say, well, with Confederation and the state becoming involved and joining Canada, your mom will get from the government every month, $8 to look after you and your 6 sisters or brothers. And so this was a very powerful message to people who did not live in a cash economy, were using the old truck barter system. This was a very powerful message to I believe the marginal man and women, that they believed in the welfare state. Could I have the next slide, please? And people came by the hundreds to those campaigns. This campaign was very visible, very public, and the marginal man and woman had to make a choice. They could either vote for constitutional arrangements around voting and independence for the state, or they could vote around notions of a social welfare state. Next slide, please. And this map is very, very telling. The red is the rural part of the country. These are small communities, fishing communities, logging communities, where subsistence living is still the norm in the middle of the 20th century. And if you look and see at this map, the red are those who supported union with Canada. The capital city is on the sort of the eastern extreme around those numbers 18 and 19 that you see on the map. That is the urban centers. They voted for independence. They voted to remain a separate country. But as you can see, those two colors, there's a real distinction between how those two groups vote. The marginal man and woman, they vote to join Canada because it would be an embracing the welfare state, the new relationship between citizen and state. It was social citizenship. They were looking for the state to help them out of their poverty, out of their lack of facilities and services that had become accepted in most of North America. Next slide, please. Finally, conclusion, I would make 2 points. First, there has been an impulse among academics and commentators to argue that citizens living in places where literacy and education levels are low and living standards little more than subsistent, what I would consider to be Park's marginal man and woman. Academics have said they're incapable of participating rationally in a democratic process. The marginal man and woman, we are told, is unintelligent, uninformed, fails to understand the issues in the democratic system. Explanations that attack the marginal man or woman as incompetent are not particularly useful, valid, or enlightening, and certainly they do not allow for the understanding of the fears, anxieties, hopes, and dreams that people have when they vote. One must look beyond the idea of misinformed and obtuse voters and notions of hysteria, prejudice, and irrationality as explanatory factors in understanding the collective reasoning why voters who fit Park's marginal man or woman concept voted as they did when Newfoundland joined Canada. Those individuals, perhaps poorly educated, wrestled with the important economic and social issues, and they decided they would be better off in 1869 by staying out of Canada and in 1948 of joining. The marginal man, woman may have lacked intimate details of the negotiations, but in both instances, they knew which choice was best for them. And second, and finally, the historical moments described here demonstrate that marginal man and woman can coalesce on a single issue, such as during a referendum or a single issue election. In such instances, there is no dissolution of their identity or of their social or economic status as marginal, which they occupy when they occupy a specific geographic place. When confronting a single issue in the democratic process, such as whether or not to join Canada, the marginal man, the marginal woman that lived in the economic and social margins of society was able to strategically identify their own marginality and coalesce as a cohesive group to exercise power. Perhaps, as the case in the Brexit referendum in 2016, marginal man and woman were asked in Newfoundland in 1869 and 1948, were they happy with their existing social, political, and economic circumstances, or if they sought an alternative. In both cases, they might not have overcome their marginality, but in those moments, they played a critical role in the political decisions affecting their future, and they voted in their best interests. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raymond. So we may have some questions. Merci beaucoup. Si vous avez des questions, voilà, je laisse peut-être Marie-Christine.
Ouais, merci Emmanuelle. C'est pas une question. This is not a question. This is just a remark. We can see here the political aspect of transnationalism and how political borders, in a way, can be crossed, and how political identity can be built. So thank you so much, Raymond, because here we have an original case of transnationalism. That is a kind of the political dimension of transnationalism. That's it. Sorry, it was not a question, just a remark. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Donc, quelqu'un voudrait prendre la parole? Je ne vois pas de main se lever ni de message s'écrire. Je vais donc me permettre de la prendre. Je vais essayer de le dire en français, Raymond. Si vraiment ça pose problème, je passerai à l'anglais. J'ai été très frappée de voir que l'État, pour ces personnes, représente un véritable interlocuteur à travers une série d'espaces et d'institutions, le vote, bien sûr, mais aussi le service militaire. Et merci, parce qu'en effet, c'est un aspect qui mérite d'être développé dans cette vision de marge constamment renégociée, premièrement. Et j'ai une question concernant les femmes, puisque les femmes sont, dans un premier temps, finalement exclues de cette participation par le vote, par le suffrage. Elles ne font pas non plus le service militaire. Comment ça se passe pour ces marginal women dans leur sentiment d'identité et d'appartenance?
Yeah, I'll answer in English if that's okay. You know, I think this comes from a book that we're doing, and one of the things that we do not know, and we don't have enough information on, is the women. There were no exit polls as we have today, but what we're beginning to see in the little information that we have been able to gather is that women voted overwhelmingly once they were given the vote in Newfoundland in 1925. There was a long suffrage movement, and they finally got the vote in 1925. And women, from what we can tell and what we know from oral history, is that not only did women come in large numbers to vote, but women were frequently the better educated, although education levels were among the lowest in North America. But it was more likely that a woman could read and write than her husband. And we're wondering whether or not only did women vote, but they probably understood the issues and convinced their husbands and brothers and fathers to vote a particular way. I think in those communities, the woman was very much in control, and I think they were the ones that we don't have a smoking gun, but we think that the women were critical in that particular election. And the military aspect is interesting as well. And there was a great fear, and even in the two world wars, the Newfoundland men didn't volunteer as quickly as did men in the rest of Canada. And we believe that women may have had some impact in that because a woman in those communities where a husband is absent, where you're struggling, the family unit was faced very tough times. So I think women are a critical factor, and I wish we had more information and there were more sources to flesh that out a little more.
Thank you very much. Des questions peut-être?
Je voudrais poser une question
oui, bien sûr.
à M. Blake. Bon, avec l'établissement de ces États sociaux, États protecteurs, s'il y a eu, comme il y a eu aux États-Unis, des lois de restriction pour l'immigration. Moi, ça m'intéresse parce que moi, je travaille surtout migration. D'ailleurs, c'était ça que je devais présenter ce matin. Je suis désolée. Mais est-ce que au Canada, dans le Canada, dans la partie que vous travaillez, il y a eu ces lois restrictives qui ont répondu peut-être à cet état de protection sociale.
I was trying to link it back to the 1860s
No, in the 40s.
Yes. Yes and no. The Canadian government recently has said that, particularly when Mr. Trump was in office in the United States, that Canada is open, that Canada is welcoming. That was the public statement by our Prime Minister. However, once a number of people from the United States in particular started to cross the border at what Canadians called unauthorized entry points, there was a very strong reaction to people who were jumping the queue, people who were coming in without following due course. At the same time, not publicized, the Canadian government was sending immigrants back to the US and not really helping people to come in the numbers that the public expressions of welcomeness seem to indicate they would. So on the one level, the rhetoric was, we are open. At a more administrative level, it was, let's make everything difficult so that people cannot get in and that we will continue to deport people who we don't want.
Yes,
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, but that was in from 2016 to now.
Yes.
But in the 30s, 1930.
Oh,
because is the time. There are some how do you say, restrictive laws for migration that were exported to Mexico because it was unfiltered. But I wonder, I listen to you, if the same kind of restriction were placed in Canada between 1920 and 1940.
Yes, absolutely. The regulations, Canada had a very open immigration policy, although very oriented towards Europe. In the 19th century, into the early 20th century, in the 1930s, the doors were closed. And the immigration basically ceased between 1928, 1929, till the 1940s. Of course, not many during the war, but certainly very tough restrictions in the 1930s.
Yeah, as in the United States.
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Raymond.